Two ships. Both had radar, both saw each other coming. They still collided at 40 knots, no storm, no freak wave, no one passed out at the helm, just fog. And two crews who were absolutely, completely, professionally certain they knew what they were doing. That's the part that should keep you up at night. Because this wasn't the Titanic, where you can point at the iceberg, point at the captain who ignored warnings, point at the company that pushed for speed. This was something messier, something that doesn't give you a clean villain to blame. Two modern ships, two radar systems working perfectly, two experienced crews making decisions that made complete sense to them, and 46 people died anyway. This is the story of the Andrea Doria, and why the disaster didn't end when she sank. Let's set the scene properly. Because context matters here. It's July 25th, 1956, summer in the Atlantic. The Andrea Doria is on the final leg of her crossing from Genoa to New York, carrying 1,706 passengers and crew. She's 9 days into the voyage. People are relaxed. Dinner has been served. The bars are doing good business. Some passengers have already gone to bed. Others are sitting on deck watching the stars. Or they would be, except tonight there are no stars. Tonight there's fog. Dense, thick, white fog stretching across the shipping lanes off Nantucket Island. The kind of fog that turns a ship's searchlight into a useless glow. The kind that makes the ocean feel like a small, enclosed room. But here's the thing. Fog wasn't panic-inducing in 1956 the way it once was. Because now ships had radar. And radar, as far as most mariners were concerned, had changed everything. You didn't need to see anymore. You could detect, you could track, you could know where other vessels were even in zero visibility. The Andrea Doria was one of the most advanced ships afloat. Launched in 1952, she was Italy's post-war statement to the world. Gleaming white hull, 9 decks, air conditioning throughout, 3 separate swimming pools placed, one for each class. Artwork on board worth millions. She wasn't just a ship. She was a symbol. A carefully constructed message that said, Italy is back. Italian engineering is world-class. Come sail with us and feel the difference. And Captain Piero Calamai was exactly the kind of man you'd want commanding her. Experienced, decorated, calm under pressure. He'd been sailing since before most of his passengers were born. He was not a reckless man. That matters. Remember that. Coming the other direction, westbound through the same fog, was the Stockholm. A Swedish-American liner, smaller than the Doria, more compact, built partially for northern routes. Her bow was reinforced for light ice. She was a handsome ship, reliable, well-run. On her bridge that night was 3rd Officer Johan Ernst Carstens Johansson, 26 years old. Young, yes, but certified, trained, and carrying out a standard watch. His captain was off duty, resting. Normal procedure for a routine crossing. So you have the Doria heading east to west toward New York. You have the Stockholm heading west to east away from New York. Standard opposing traffic. Happens constantly on these shipping lanes. Both ships had radar running. Both picked up the other signal. Both started tracking. And here, right here, is where the story quietly, invisibly, catastrophically begins to fall apart. Captain Calamai on the Andrea Doria is watching his radar screen. A target appears off the starboard bow. He tracks it, calculates. The bearing looks steady, the range is decreasing. Standard stuff. He makes a judgment. This is a vessel crossing from his right. And the right move is to turn slightly to port, to the left, which should open up the passing distance and let them slip by each other safely. He orders the turn. Confident. Reasonable. On the Stockholm, 3rd Officer Carstens Johansson is looking at his radar. He sees the Doria's signal too, but here's the thing. He interprets it differently. Based on what he's reading, he believes the Andrea Doria is passing well off to the side, moving away. No immediate concern. But to be safe, he adjusts course slightly to starboard, to the right. Now pause. Feel the horror of this. Both men are doing their jobs. Both are looking at radar. Both are making calculated, professional decisions based on what they see. But they're seeing different things. Not because one radar is broken, but because radar in 1956 required interpretation. It showed you blips and bearings and distances, and your brain filled in the rest. The relative movement of another vessel, its actual heading, the precise geometry of the situation, all of that required the officer to calculate it, often mentally, often under time pressure. And small errors in that mental calculation, tiny misreadings of relative bearing, don't stay small when two ships are closing at a combined speed of 40 knots. At that speed, miles vanish in minutes. There is no time to double-check your math. The distance between them collapsed. Fast. And then, out of the thick white nothing, a shape materialized. Not gradual, not a slow emergence. Just suddenly, horribly there. Stockholm's reinforced bow designed for ice appeared through the fog like a blade, and the Andrea Doria was right there, broadside, her lit decks suddenly visible through the vapor, 700 feet of steel glowing, and completely unable to get out of the way. Orders were shouted, engines thrown into reverse, helm spun hard over, but you cannot stop 29,000 tons of ship in seconds. Physics doesn't negotiate. At 11:10 p.m., in Stockholm's bow drove into Andrea Doria's starboard side. The impact opened a gash nearly 40 feet long, steel folded inward like tin. And cabins on multiple decks were annihilated instantly. Passengers sleeping in their bunks simply never woke up. Others were hurled across their rooms by the force of the blow. In the corridors, people were thrown off their feet, slammed into walls, tangled in suddenly tilting furniture. The sound wasn't what you'd imagine. No massive explosion. What survivors described was something almost worse. A deep, sustained groan. Metal tearing. The shudder running through the entire ship like a living thing flinching. Steam venting somewhere below. And then the noise slowly dying away, leaving behind a horrible, pressurized silence. Stockholm's bow crumpled badly but held together. Her reinforced structure had absorbed the blow, damaged but stable. Andrea Doria had a hole in her side, and the ocean was already coming through it. Here's what most people don't know about the Andrea Doria. And it's the part that turns this from a bad collision into a catastrophe. The collision itself didn't sink her. What sank her was already happening before Stockholm ever appeared. As the Doria had crossed the Atlantic, her fuel tanks had steadily emptied. That's normal. Ships burn fuel. Tanks get lighter. What's supposed to happen is you fill those tanks with seawater as ballast, maintaining the ship's weight distribution low in the hull where it belongs. The Doria's crew hadn't fully done that. Not negligence exactly. A judgment call. An efficiency decision. Running with partially empty tanks meant slightly better speed and handling. Totally standard in the industry. Hundreds of crossings had been made this way without incident. But it meant that when Stockholm's bow punched through that starboard side, the water that came rushing in had nothing to counter it. The list started immediately. 7 degrees, not alarming, 10 degrees. Getting serious. 15 degrees. Now it's bad. The problem compounded itself. As the ship tilted, water that should have been contained by watertight bulkheads started climbing toward the top of those bulkheads. The Andrea Doria was designed to survive flooding in 2 adjacent compartments. 5 were now breached, and because the ship was listing, the flooding was uneven. Water cascading to the low side, making the list worse, which made the flooding worse, which made the list worse. A downward spiral that engineers call progressive flooding. And the crew below decks tried counter-flooding, deliberately flooding port-side compartments to rebalance the ship. It didn't work. The inflow rate on the starboard side was too overwhelming. The damage was too spread out. 20 degrees, 25, and then came the lifeboat problem. Andrea Doria carried more lifeboats than maritime regulations required. Every passenger and crew member had a spot. The paperwork was clean, the safety drills had been done. But lifeboats are designed to be lowered from a stable, upright ship. Once the list passed 15 degrees, the port-side boats couldn't swing out over the water. They were hanging inward against the ship's hull. And the starboard boats? Hanging over the damaged side, already too high above the waterline on a listing ship to safely lower. To over half the evacuation capacity was functionally useless. Not because anyone cut corners. Not because the lifeboats were defective. Because every safety calculation made during the ship's design assumed one thing that was no longer true. That the ship would be roughly level. She wasn't level. She was tilting toward the sea and accelerating toward worse. Captain Calamai understood what the flooding reports meant. He'd been doing the math in his head, and the math kept returning the same answer. The ship was not going to recover. Distress calls went out within minutes of impact. Position given. Situation described. And the ocean, which had just tried to kill 1,700 people, now gave them one thing in their favor. They weren't alone out there. Several ships were within range, but the one that mattered most, and the one that would define this night, was the Ile-de-France, a French liner, larger than the Doria, about 50 miles away, sailing eastbound. Her captain, Raoul de Baudillon, got the distress call, looked at his charts, looked at his crew, and made his decision in about 30 seconds flat. He turned the ship around, full speed, no committee, no lengthy deliberation. He just turned around and went. That decision would save hundreds of lives. Through the night, Andrea Doria continued her slow, relentless lean. 20 degrees, 25. Passengers gathered on the high side of the ship, the port side, the side still above water, wrapped in whatever they'd grabbed from their cabins. Some were in evening clothes, some in pajamas. Children clutched parents. Elderly passengers sat on tilted deck chairs looking at the fog. Crew members did something remarkable. They kept order. They tied ropes along passageways as makeshift handholds so people could climb across what were now sloping floors. They guided passengers steadily toward the lifeboats that could still be launched. They kept their voices calm even when their faces told a different story. When the Ile-de-France arrived and emerged through the fog, her silhouette appearing in the dark like a wall of light, people on the Doria's decks reportedly broke into spontaneous cheering. The rescue that followed was extraordinary given the conditions. Lifeboats shuttled back and forth across dark water. Ropes thrown between vessels. Passengers lowered in cargo nets. Children passed hand to hand from boat to boat. And here's a detail that deserves a moment of acknowledgement. Stockholm's crew, eyeing the people from the ship that had just punched a hole in the Doria, lowered their own lifeboats and joined the rescue. The ship that delivered the wound helped carry the wounded to safety, through darkness, in fog, in the North Atlantic. By the time the evacuation was complete, more than 1,600 people had been pulled off the Andrea Doria alive. 46 died, most of them in the initial collision, in the cabins that were destroyed on impact. For a maritime disaster unfolding at night, at sea, in fog, with a listing ship, that rescue number is almost miraculous. But Andrea Doria wasn't done yet. She was still there, still floating, still slowly losing the fight. By morning, the fog thinned. And what the daylight revealed to everyone watching from the rescue vessels was something almost surreal. A great ship on her side, not sunk, not exploded, just leaning. Leaning so severely her decks ran at impossible angles. Her magnificent superstructure skewed against the horizon like a building settling into soft ground. She listed past 30 degrees. Then 35. Debris slid off her decks and into the water. Furniture broke free from bolted moorings and tumbled. Below the waterline, spaces that had been ballrooms and cabins and engine rooms were now full of cold, black Atlantic. Captain Calamai was one of the last to leave. He had to be convinced to go. He stood on the bridge until nearly the last possible moment, personally verifying that no one remained aboard. Then he descended into a lifeboat and watched his ship from the water. There are accounts of him weeping. At 10:09 a.m., 11 hours after the collision, the bow finally slipped under. The stern lifted. The propellers broke the surface, massive bronze blades catching the morning light for the last time. For a few seconds, the ship seemed to hang there, half in the water, half in the air, balanced on nothing. Then she rolled and went. The ocean closed over her in seconds. No dramatic final wave, no explosion, just a patch of roiling, disturbed water, a spreading slick of fuel and debris, and then nothing. The Atlantic looked almost unchanged. She came to rest 240 feet below the surface, lying on her starboard side. Right on the wound, 50 miles south of Nantucket. The shipping lanes stayed open. The fog lifted by afternoon. Other ships passed through, and beneath the surface, the Andrea Doria began a different chapter. The wreck divers came within years. 240 feet. That's the depth she settled at. And that number is deceptive, because 240 feet sounds manageable if you're thinking about recreational diving. A serious dive, sure, but doable. It's not manageable, not down there, not at that site. Divers started calling the Andrea Doria the Mount Everest of wreck diving, and they didn't mean that as a compliment or a marketing phrase. They meant it as a warning. Because Everest doesn't kill you with one single danger, it kills you with a combination of factors that each seem survivable on their own. Altitude, cold, exhaustion, weather, time, until suddenly they aren't. The Doria is the same. At 240 feet, you're in technical diving territory. The kind where you don't use regular compressed air. You use specialized gas mixtures to manage narcosis and oxygen toxicity. And the kind where your decompression schedule on the way back up can take longer than the actual dive. The kind where a single miscalculation in your gas planning, a single unexpected current that burns through your air faster than projected, a single moment of confusion about which way is up, can kill you before you reach the surface. And the site itself adds layers on top of that. Cold Atlantic currents sweep across the wreck unpredictably. The water temperature at depth hovers just above freezing. Visibility is unreliable. One moment you're in clear blue water with 40-foot sightlines, and the next a silt cloud or a current shift drops it to absolute zero. Fishing nets drift through the superstructure, snagging on everything, invisible in the murk until they've wrapped around your tank or your regulator hose. And the wreck is changing. Always changing. Because she went down lying on her side, the entire internal layout of the ship is rotated 90 degrees. What was a corridor is now a vertical shaft. What was a ceiling is now a wall. What was a floor, where you'd instinctively put your fins for reference, is now a wall too, and your instincts are useless. Divers who enter the interior describe it as a labyrinth where the rules keep shifting. Beams groan. Metal flakes away when touched. One wrong fin kick fills the space with silt, and suddenly you're blind, disoriented, inside a deteriorating steel structure 240 feet under the Atlantic with a finite amount of breathing gas and no visual reference for which direction leads out. The 1981 storm accelerated collapse in certain sections. A 2016 storm took more. Upper decks that were once accessible have pancaked. On passageways that were known routes in the 1970s are now compressed cavities. The swimming pools that passengers once lounged around on summer crossings are collapsed and buried in sediment. The ship is not preserved. She's decaying, in slow motion becoming part of the seafloor, and yet people keep going down. Because the wreck still holds things, china from the dining rooms, portholes, safes, personal artifacts from the cabins. For some divers, that's the draw, recovering a piece of history, a tangible object from 1956 that no one has touched since the ship went down. For others, it's simpler than that. It's the challenge, the benchmark. The thing you point to in technical diving circles when you want to say, I've been there. More than a dozen divers have died on the Andrea Doria since she sank. Let that sit for a second. The ship lost 46 people the night she went down. And in the decades since, as a wreck sitting still on the bottom, she has quietly accumulated more victims. Not all at once. Not in a single dramatic event. Just steadily, consistently. One dive season at a time. Some were highly experienced technical divers. People who had logged hundreds of deep dives. People who knew the site from previous visits. People who did everything right up until the one thing they didn't. Some got entangled in debris inside the hull. Some were hit by sudden current shifts on the ascent. Some ran decompression calculations that worked on paper and failed in reality. Some simply disappeared inside the wreck and never came back out. The ocean kept their stories. The irony is genuinely dark. Andrea Doria was built with redundant safety systems. Watertight compartments, excess lifeboat capacity, radar navigation. Every innovation available in 1952 to make ocean travel safer for the people aboard. She became far more dangerous to the people who chose to visit her afterward. After the bodies were counted and the survivors were interviewed and the lawyers gathered in New York, everyone wanted the same thing. Whose fault was it? It's a reasonable question. Two ships collide in a disaster that kills 46 people. Someone must be responsible. Someone made the wrong call. Someone violated the rules. Point at the person, assign the blame, close the book. The investigation tried. It genuinely tried. It looked at radar interpretation. Both officers had tracked the other vessel. Both had made course corrections. But the question was whether those corrections were proper under maritime collision regulations, the rules that govern who gives way to whom and how. Some investigators argued that Captain Calamai's port turn was the critical error, that standard crossing protocol called for a starboard turn, and deviating from that created the collision geometry. Others pushed back hard. They argued that Stockholm's radar assessment was wrong from the start, that the ship's radar may have been miscalibrated, that Carstens Johansson was reading bearings that didn't reflect reality, and every decision he made after that was built on a false picture. There were accusations, counter-accusations, competing testimony from officers who had been on the bridges that night and who remembered events differently. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Both things can be true simultaneously. Stockholm's radar may have been giving inaccurate readings, and Calamai's port turn may have violated standard protocol. And Carstens Johansson, a 26-year-old officer running a solo watch, may have been in over his head for that specific scenario, and the speeds both ships were maintaining in dense fog may have been too high regardless of what the regulations technically permitted. Multiple failures, multiple contributors, no single smoking gun. In 1957, before the legal proceedings could produce a definitive public ruling, both shipping companies settled privately. No formal admission of fault from either side, no official judgment declaring who caused the collision. The case closed without closing. Historians have been arguing about it ever since. At the final minutes before impact, the exact sequence of maneuvers, the precise radar readings, what each officer actually saw and thought and decided, remain genuinely disputed. The testimony was contradictory. Physical evidence was limited. The ships were the only real witnesses, and one of them was at the bottom of the ocean. What we're left with is something more unsettling than a clear answer. Two experienced crews, functioning technology, clear detection of the other vessel, reasonable professional decisions made under pressure. And still, they hit each other. Because radar in 1956 was powerful but required interpretation, and interpretation is human. And humans, even experienced, well-trained, careful humans, can read the same information differently and reach opposite conclusions and each be completely confident they're right. And the ships approached each other with the confidence that technology gave them. That confidence replaced the caution that fog should have demanded. Neither ship slowed down the way they might have if they'd been navigating blind. Because they weren't blind. They could see on their screens. They knew the other ship was there. They just didn't know what the other ship was about to do, and by the time they found out, there were seconds left. Here's why this story matters beyond 1956. The Andrea Doria disaster didn't happen because people were careless or incompetent or cutting corners for profit. It happened because of something much harder to legislate against: the gap between what technology tells you and what's actually happening. Radar said, there is a ship. Here is its position. Here is its distance. To radar did not say, here is what its crew is thinking. Here is what maneuver they're about to make. Here is the interpretation error your counterpart on the other bridge is currently making. That gap between instrument reading and complete situational understanding is where the collision lived. And that gap didn't disappear when radar got better, or when GPS arrived, or when automatic collision avoidance systems were developed. It just changed shape. The specific technical limitations of 1956 radar were eventually fixed. But the fundamental human problem, the tendency to trust our interpretation of data more than the data warrants, that's still with us. In aviation, in medicine, in financial markets, in every field where humans use instruments to understand complex, fast-moving situations and then make decisions based on that understanding. We see what the screen shows us. We fill in the rest with assumptions. And sometimes the assumptions are wrong, and by the time we know that, we're already 40 knots into an irreversible situation. Andrea Doria rests on the seafloor right now. Has been there since July 26, 1956. She's corroding slowly, collapsing in sections, becoming part of the Atlantic bottom. In another century, she may be unrecognizable. Stockholm was repaired, renamed, sailed for decades more under different flags, eventually scrapped. The 46 people who died were given no verdict explaining why. The 1,600 who survived carry a story that still doesn't have a clean ending. And the divers who've died on the wreck since, they made a choice that the original passengers never got to make. They chose to go down there. They understood the risks, or thought they did. The ocean is not particularly interested in whether you understood the risks. It's just there. Cold, dark, patient, waiting to show you the difference between what you think is happening and what's actually happening. That's the lesson the Andrea Doria has been teaching since 1956. Two ships, both had radar, both saw each other coming. The fog doesn't care what your instruments say, and neither does the sea.